My childhood began in Kansas because I was born there, but all of my parents and my older siblings were born in Texas, and so that was really where all the family was. But my father was employed in Kansas, and we lived there until I was in the second grade, and then after something of a tragedy struck our family, in which my father, who worked for an oil company and had a good job, and I would guess that we were probably middle-class income people, also liked his social life, drinking and with some buddies, and unfortunately during Prohibition he drank some what was called Jamaican gin then. That was the trade name, but it really was a bootlegged whiskey that was poisonous and caused him to become lose the use of his legs and his arms. He went to a sanatorium for, my guess is about 18 months. And during that time, to recover, or to try to recover, he did regain use of his arms, but never the use of his legs. He could move around, take care of himself, but he never was able to work. So while he was at the sanatorium, my mother took us back to Texas. And so that nice middle-class income family in Kansas sort of dissolved into Depression era, no working husband in the family and father, and mother having to be the wage earner or the support for the family. There were no wages either during the Depression. And so Texas was very different from what I knew as a very young child in Kansas. It was a pretty big shock for all of us all the way around in terms of lifestyle and what we could do. So we went back to Texas, and even after my father came home, we all realized that he was not going to be able to work. Mother took in washing until the programs began under Franklin Roosevelt after his election in 1932. First of all, we were able to get food. Food had been a very precious commodity in our household. Fortunately, Mother grew up on a farm and was a very resourceful woman. I have to say we relied on Salvation Army. That was about the only assistance that anyone could find in those days. Sometimes churches helped a bit, but generally she relied on her own initiative to, and some family that had a large farm and lived in a community about 70 miles from Wichita Falls, who helped us out a bit. When they came, they all came with loaded vegetables and things, from even meat in the wintertime, from their resources. So growing up during the Depression was pretty tough on everybody, but it was especially tough on my family because we just had sort of preceded the Depression with our own personal family depression. I did graduate from high school in Wichita Falls, Texas. However, the high school only went through the 11th grade then in Texas, or at least in our school district. I don't know about other schools in the state. And then I had 1 year at Texas Wesleyan College as a freshman when I was told by a recruiter that I could work and go to school. And I did. Worked in a department store and went to school and earned $8 a week, and 4 of that went for my tuition, and 4 of it was bus fare and food for that whole year. I did not continue the following year. That was Pearl Harbor occurred in December while I was at Texas Wesleyan, and it just changed the dynamics of society totally, and including me. I then learned I could get a pretty good job while this war was heating up, and I took a job at a telephone company during the summer and decided to stay in Wichita Falls, not go back to Fort Worth to school. I don't know what I was thinking, probably to help the war effort, probably because I'd never made that kind of money before, and it was just a good job, and probably because I had met a young man who was interested in me and had asked me to marry him, and which I did that fall. So a lot of things developed over that period of time that was prompted primarily by World War II and all of the events that happened after that. We had one daughter while he was still in the service in Texas, and then came to Oregon after the war in 1945. Continued to have a family. Son was born in Klamath Falls, and we went to Lakeview for a year. Bill Rice was my husband, the children's father. He had left a good job at First National Bank when he went in the service. That job was still waiting for him, as most jobs were, for the guys who were in the military. And so we went back and located in Klamath Falls, and he was transferred to Lakeview. We kind of stopped off in Portland for a few months, where the second daughter was born, third child was born, before he went on to LeGrand, where we settled down for a little while. Had 6 good years in LeGrand. My oldest daughter went through grades 1 through 6 in LeGrand. The oldest son started school there, went through 2nd grade, and we had another youngster there, another baby there, a boy. So I had 2 girls and 2 boys, girl, boy, and each one born in a different place, and 1 in Texas and 3 in Oregon. And Bill was transferred to Portland, so we went to Portland. I did decide to go back to school while we were in LeGrand. After those 4 children came along, and I began to remember the hard time my mother had raising we 3 children and supporting the family, that I began to wonder what my life would be like if something happened to their father. And it was really a very frightening sort of thing to think about, and yet realistically I needed to. He was on the road traveling for the bank in all of Eastern Oregon during that 6 years, and I just decided that I couldn't do the kind of work that my mother had done, and didn't want to deprive my children either. So I kept thinking about that 1 year in Texas when I wanted to be a PE teacher more than anything in the world, and that I should go back to Eastern Oregon College and begin my college work again. And so I did that. And then we moved to Portland. I continued to Portland State. Well, the first challenge was, of course, my husband. And that's a pretty big challenge to overcome, because this was the 50s and women just didn't do that sort of thing. Pretty traditional for women to stay at home, men to work, a very conformist society. Women had their role to play and men had theirs. And for this mother of 4 to decide to go to school was just really unheard of among my friends. And though my husband expressed his dislike for me to go to school, I continued, and then continued after we came to Portland. I encountered some professors who were not sure about this older woman in class, but I also encountered many who were very supportive and who just accepted me as another student. And particularly there was one at Eastern Oregon who encouraged me to continue to go after he knew I was moving to Portland. And then encountered professors at Portland State who were especially helpful. So I had some negative responses to the fact that I had gone back to school. Some of my friends didn't understand it. I began to tell them I really didn't know what I was going to do with my education, but I knew I would probably be a teacher, as I had started out to be a PE teacher. But I was discouraged from becoming a PE teacher because I was too old, according to one registrar, at the age of 32. And at any rate, I encountered the age thing quite a lot along the way. But I decided that that was probably not what I wanted to do anyway, that I was more interested in substantive subjects such as social sciences to teach. So I did graduate from Portland State and did begin to teach. You know, it all came quite naturally to me, it seemed. I was a good organizer. In fact, that was one of the things that living in LeGrand, in a big house, two-story house that had a coal furnace that had to be stoked morning and night, and my husband gone all week, and I had 4 children. So, you know, you learn how to organize and get things done and keep everybody in the family happy and right along with you. But it seemed to me that my oldest daughter, she was somewhere in the 1st grade, after she began to realize and how much she liked being in school. We had no kindergartens in Oregon then, so she hadn't experienced that or any preschool. But apparently someone at school told her that she was very bright, and she was a good student. And I remember that she came home one day and said, "I'm going to go to college when I get out of high school," she said. And I kept thinking about that smart aleck remark of hers and said, well, I certainly hope so. And then I said, but, you know, kind of, well, you know, maybe I ought to stay one jump ahead of her, and that I ought to go back to school and get my rest of my college education. And I think it was just, it seemed to me to be just a substitute for the golf I was playing, the bridge I was playing, the PTA president I was being, and other women's groups that I was involved in, that I could just as well spend that time going to class and studying. It really didn't take any more of my time away from the family. It was just a new direction. Instead of doing the woman stuff, you know, I did the student stuff. And that all made much more sense to me than playing the role of wife and mother all the time. And I think it was very stimulating mentally for me and for the children, because they knew that they were students and I was a student, and we all went to school. And even after I started teaching, I went to school, they went to school. It was just a very normal thing in my family. Well, I started teaching at Reynolds High School in social studies, and I wanted to teach seniors in their what was called a modern problems class then. But the superintendent there had some other ideas for me, and he wanted me to be a full-time dean of girls, which was not. I was being half-time dean because it was a small school. It was the first few years of of Reynolds High School was a new school. So I transferred to Centennial High School, where I could teach full classes of seniors in my chosen subject, hoping that I could give something to these young students, young men and women who were going to be out in the world after their graduation, many of them not going on to college, to sort of prepare them a little bit more for some productive life as a citizen, participating in community affairs and in politics and so on. And as a result of that, as a result of the work I did in political science at Portland State, I decided that that was my area of intense interest. And I also realized that if I had a master's degree, I could make more money teaching. So the two worked together, and I went to University of Oregon and completed a master's degree there in 1962. Again, stimulated by that work in political science, I decided that I wouldn't stop there, that really a PhD in political science would move me into college teaching, where I could do research and writing and have some more flexible schedule, dig more deeply into an area that I'd become very interested in, which was public opinion and polling. Relatively new in terms of using in campaigns, not so new in terms of just the sense of taking polls, but they were pretty primitive. All of it had to be done by hand, but discovered this huge machine that would tabulate the cards that we students put our answers on, the key punch type process that was used with those early new computers. So the combination of doing the research, getting the answers back in a hurry, doing the analysis was extremely intriguing to me. And I thought, this is what I want to do. This is where I want to go. So I talked to the chair of the political science department at University of Oregon, who was a person by the name of Burt Wingert then, and I just said, I want to talk with you about what I would have to do to get a PhD, because I had no idea how much time to spend on campus, how much I could stay in Portland, whether I'd have to teach some as a teaching assistant at University of Oregon. I was simply curious, is this something that's possible for me to do? And his reaction was quite immediate. I know he didn't expect me to ask him that question, but he seemed to have an answer in a hurry, which was, Betty, I can't let you do that. You're 39 years old, and by the time you get your PhD, you'll be 45, and you'll only have 20 years to repay the taxpayers of Oregon for their investment in you. That was a pretty detailed response that I hadn't anticipated, and I knew immediately that, or realized immediately that I was not going to be their first woman candidate for a PhD. They'd never had one. They'd only recently hired a woman in their political science department, but the word around was that she was having a very hard time with the other professors there. And so it was just not, there was just not going to be a woman in their political science department, either as a PhD candidate or a professor. That was pretty hard rejection for me to take. I just had come along and just had thought, it's out there for me to take and to do and to use, and that's what education is all about. And so it was a pretty stunning answer for me. So that terminated my career in political science, at least, not politics, but my career in political science. And on the way home from Eugene, all the way back to Portland in August, an old beat-up station wagon with no air conditioning, I really was very puzzled about Dr. Wingert's answer. Knew that I had no appeal, knew that he had the final say in what happened in his department, and was pretty angry about the rejection. But I began to think about what else I might do, and few schools in Portland were available to me. Only Portland State I thought I could afford. The private schools I just had concluded would probably be too expensive. And Portland State was so new that it had no master's programs, much less a PhD program at that time. And so then I began to think about the night law school, which I'd only heard about from people I had met in the Democratic Party I had become somewhat politically active. I had run for the school board and won an election in 1960. I was enjoying being on the school board and had won a re-election to the board without opposition. I guess I put on a pretty good campaign the first time around. What was going through my mind was, what can I do that will keep me moving in the same direction in which I'm interested, which is public issues, what's going on in the world and in our country, what's going on in politics, and the history along with it, of course. And I remembered from the people I'd met in the Democratic Party, as had also become a precinct committee woman, and had gone to some Democratic Central Committee meetings. I'd heard lawyers talking about the night law school, and so I thought, well, that's a possibility. I should investigate that. I had to continue to teach because by this time I was divorced, and I had the children to raise. My responsibility I took on 100% then, and it was not that I wanted to be a lawyer when I first thought about it. It was maybe if I get a law degree, a PhD would be a substitute for the doctorate in political science, and that then a college would hire me as a professor. I could go on, I could sort of just deviate around that decision of Dr. Wingert's and still come out on the other end as I had planned. But after going to the school, which I did, and after thinking about it more thoroughly, I thought, well, even if I go to this night law school for 4 years, 3 nights a week, it wouldn't be too bad to be a lawyer. And in fact, it might be a better career than what I had been thinking about in political science. And so I went to the law school within the next week, because I wanted to get something going before I started back to school teaching in the fall, and was told that school would start in about a week, and I'd better talk to the person who could tell me about getting books and classes. And Judge Gantenbein, who interviewed me, just stuck out his hand and said, well, congratulations and welcome to Northwestern School of Law. So that meant to me, I guess, I had been accepted. And so I started law school in about a week or 10 days after that. So to me, the lesson there is, I guess, how to overcome rejection and not be bitter about it, but to find some alternate way to still achieve a goal. And fortunately, there were opportunities available, and I took advantage of the opportunities. So certainly that law school was a major turning point in my life. I suppose my interest in political science and then ultimately in the law stemmed from many of my experiences that I had that went back to my childhood. One was when we were with my grandparents in Sherman, Texas, on our way from Kansas to Wichita Falls. Was certainly unanticipated, and as a child, I was still it was the summer that I was out of the second grade, and the courthouse was on fire. My mother and we children all gathered out on a neighbor's lawn up on a hill to see what we could of what was going on, and we were told that some vigilantes had started the fire in the courthouse because there was a trial going on of a young black man who had been accused of raping a white woman. This was not unusual in the deeper South, a little bit more unusual in Texas, but it certainly for me and for my family, Um, I had not experienced living around black folks very much, and in Kansas, it came in as a free state into the Union, and then I had not experienced it really in Texas, but and too young. I would have been protected from it anyway by my family. But the story was, and it was told to my mother there, was that that the black man was on trial, and that the citizens, some citizens, men, had stormed the courthouse to try to get him out of the trial, to take justice into their own hands, and to kill him, and lynch him probably for as an example to other people in the black community, that this is what happened when they tried to, associate with white people. And I have no idea whether the man was guilty or not. I doubt it, based upon what history has told us. But then when I went back to do some research in my early childhood, I went to the Sherman Courthouse, and this, of course, I learned this as an adult, and talked to the clerk there, who I wanted to see some of my grandparents' records, their wills and their deeds to their farm and so on. And I told her what I remembered about this incident. And she said, well, your memory's good as far as it goes, but would you like to see the official recording of what happened? And I did, and that's in my book, Written by Grace, and simply is just a brief paragraph saying that on that certain date, that the courthouse was stormed by these men who wanted to take the black man. They had locked him in an upper story prison cell, and somehow or other, so then they decided the only thing they could do was burn down the courthouse to get the black man. And fire trucks arrived, and they cut the fire hoses in order to let the courthouse burn. In other words, everybody would flee except the person who was in prison, and that's the way he would die. Ultimately, apparently, they did get to him, or got his body, and this is not in the official notes. The official notes just simply describe the burning of the courthouse and the loss of records and so on that took place. But the clerk told me that the story was that after they got to him and they took his body and put it behind a car and dragged it through what we call back then Blacktown. And I remember my mother standing jumping back to my childhood again, standing on that lawn just wringing her hands and saying, that poor man, because the rumor had spread quite rapidly that's what they were after in burning the courthouse. I think there were other situations certainly that molded my attitude about civil liberties and about fairness and equality, and also the role of government in all of one's life, including economic life, because certainly the fact that President Roosevelt was elected helped my mother put food on the table, gave her a job with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and helped pull my family out of poverty, and I saw it on a day-to-day basis, practically an hour-to-hour basis. And so there's no question that I grew up in that kind of an atmosphere, that some things were wrong, discrimination certainly, and taking the law into one's own hands did not make sense to me, even as a child, and the fact that there are certainly needs that people have, that government can do much good in terms of helping its people when it's necessary. So I guess I became, everyone in Texas was a Democrat anyway in those days, and all of, certainly my family supported Franklin Roosevelt. So it was just a given with me as I grew up and started working in politics and teaching politics. Well, when I became active in politics in the 1960s, Richard Neuberger and Maureen Neuberger, of course, had both been in the legislature. He in the Senate, she in the House of Representatives, and Bob Holmes had been governor in the 50s. Neuberger had Richard Neuberger had become a U.S. senator, and but he died, and then Maureen Neuberger became the senator from Oregon. As a woman, she was a role model for me. I never knew Maureen very well. Edith Green also was elected to Congress in 1954, and I never knew Edith well. I got acquainted with her because she stayed in politics for another 20 years, and but they were not mentors. They were just people who were there. They were just women who, if they can do it, I can do it sort of idea in my head. I did not have a personal connection with anyone who was an office holder when I got involved in politics, but I had married Frank Roberts in the fall of 1960, and Frank was working in the Democratic Party in Multnomah County and became chair of the Central Committee while we were married, early on in our marriage. And so I immediately became quite active along with Frank in the local party politics. And obviously then you become interested in the state. Frank and I both ran for the legislature in 1962. He ran for the Senate, and I ran for the House, and we both were defeated. Not surprising. Trying to run two campaigns out of one household was not so good. But then in 1964, when I had started law school, I had 2 years of law school, I decided that with another election that I'd come so close in the 62 election that I needed to keep my name out before the public, and that I needed to run again if I was serious about being in elected politics, and which I was. So my life was pretty stretched at that time, teaching, raising the children. Frank was a good person to have around because he had a good sense of humor, but he and I didn't see each other very often. I was at law school nights, and he was generally on his sailboat on weekends. But the children liked Frank, and I enjoyed his company very much. And I think that he was certainly a stimulating factor in my developing interest in politics, along with his developing interest in elective politics, because he had not run before then either. And so then the night law school, and then deciding to run a campaign all at once, was probably the most challenge that I'd had at one time about keeping all the balls in the air and not letting anything drop and break along the way. My oldest daughter had gone to Stanford. When I entered law school, she entered Stanford University. And I remember I've written again in the book about the fact that I just said everybody has to stay well. Nobody can get upset about anything. This just has to stay on schedule. It's just sort of like walking on eggshells until this campaign is over. And she decides to get married right in the middle of it. So there we go, in terms of having everything worked out and no surprises. But that came and went one weekend, and we continued on the campaign. And I did win that election. I did serve in the 1965 session. Well, by this time, I had a lot of experience working with men. I had certainly in my schoolwork, most all the teachers were men in social studies. Most of them were coaches, and that's where they got put for their teaching duties. Of the school board, I was the only woman. They were all men. Law school, there were only 2 women in my class, rest about 45 men. My master's degree work had been mostly men. I was probably the only woman working on a master's degree in political science that summer. So coming to the legislature where it was all men, I'd been successful so far. I really didn't give it much of a thought, but I was very eager to get acquainted with the women. The women, though, in the 65 session, many of them had been there for a number of sessions, some of them going back to the early 40s even. Grace Peck, for example, had been elected in the 1940s. And so by the time I got there in the 60s, I found the women there not to be aggressive, very passive, not very issue-oriented, didn't seem to have any particular cause that they wanted to work for. Besides this sort of group of women that I felt no relationship to in terms of the way we approach legislation, there were 2 that really fascinated me. One was Shirley Field, Republican, and one was Beulah Hand, a Democrat. And both of them were women who were exceedingly aggressive, but so much so that they made enemies almost every time they took the floor of the House to debate, and I'm sure they must have operated that way in committees. And I just decided early on that I didn't want to be like those 2, and I didn't want to be like this little group of women over here who were not actively pursuing any issues, and that I was going to have to make my own way and set my own path. And so I turned to the men legislators and got acquainted with their wives as a way to make them feel comfortable working with me. So I did have a good session in 65, even though it was my first. I served another term, 1967, in the House. In that session, I branched out and worked on in a committee with L.B. Day as the chair of the Committee on Economic Development, and one of the issues was to get funding for the establishment of a Sea Grant College at Oregon State University. And that was really one of the first issues that I ever worked on that wasn't either education or children or civil liberties, whatever. It was really the first one that had some economic overtones to it. And we were able to get that funding out of Ways and Means, and Oregon State did become a Sea Grant College. And so I felt that my role there was pretty important, because LB had made me the chair of a subcommittee that worked only on that issue. So I think that was very helpful in saying, branch out here, Betty, in the legislature, and take advantage of some other opportunities. Don't just be an education legislator. Don't just be a women's issues legislator. Be concerned about and work on many issues. And this, of course, then I was elected to the Senate in 1968. And I think the experience in the House was very valuable, because I'd made my mark there. I'd been recognized as paying attention to issues and being prepared and being willing to participate in committee meetings. And so I think I went to the Senate already known, and I had my law degree by then. And that was certainly helpful to also be recognized as a lawyer. I had begun to practice a little bit, and am by the 1969 legislature, Frank and I had been divorced for about 3 or 4 years, and I had married Keith Skelton, who was serving in the House of Representatives, and he had moved to Portland from Eugene, where he had served a number of terms before I ever came to the legislature. And so 69 was really a good year in terms of being in the Senate, being married to Keith. We commuted together in the mornings, back home in the afternoon, in the evenings together, and I felt a very solid foundation at home and at work here, and still had my teaching jobs when I wasn't in the legislature, and would move from that into ultimately just practicing law. The 1969 session was very interesting to me to observe how differently the Senate and the House chambers work. Senate has only 30 members, the House 60. House twice as many, so there's a lot more activity on the floor, a lot more noise, a lot more people to deal with, a lot more coalitions to build and to work on, a lot more egos to have to take into effect in order to get anything accomplished. So I found the Senate to be, frankly, an easier place to work. And I think the Senate, both in state legislatures and in our Congress, have a different role to play. They are looked upon as taking more time with legislation, taking perhaps more responsibility because there's fewer of them for a broader range of legislation. It was, I think I just felt more comfortable being in the Senate. One of the bills that's important from the 1969 session that I worked on all session, and it became really a very important one for my own learning process, and that was to decriminalize abortions in Oregon. It was a nationwide issue. It had lots of publicity. Colorado had decriminalized this procedure 2 years before, 1967. New York, Hawaii, Alaska were all considering legislation. It was in the news constantly. It was in women's magazines, certainly, and other magazines about what was going on behind the scenes, so to speak, and the medical issues that were being caused by what we called botched abortions, or by women who went to someone for an abortion and it was not done properly, or they had attempted abortion, a self-abortion procedure. And the doctors then were finding that they were having to follow up, and sometimes women died as a result of those procedures. So definitely the time was right. Medical Association was with us on the issue, and it was not the moral issue then that has become today in terms of the pro-life and the pro-choice people. We did get legislation through that session. It had a lot of conditions associated with it, but it passed, and then later Keith and I took a case through the federal court challenging all of those provisions, and Roe versus Wade decided our case. So I was very active in the abortion issue. I think it was sort of an epiphany for me. I had thought about many of these women's issues as not being my issues, as not being, they didn't affect me. Why am I concerned about them? Why do I feel that we have to make this issue important for women, until I began to realize that women, if they can't control their own bodies can't control their life. And I think that was the time when I began to realize that that there were a lot of women who did not have the opportunities I had, or took the opportunities I took, to work on issues and to get out of the house, that they were sort of captive in society in this conforming period. And that while I could say as I had said, if I can do it, you can do it, that wasn't true. I learned that all circumstances are not equal, that women didn't perhaps have the motivation I had or the support I had in terms of becoming involved in politics. So I decided the abortion issue was about me and was about all women. And I think that's when I decided that it was time to start working on other women's issues as well as the choice issue. So the '69 session was sort of a turning point for me in terms of the need to eliminate the discrimination that I had experienced, so that other women wouldn't have to go through that. I had no idea it would mean tackling so many of the laws and the procedures that were so part of society, and that affected women and that kept them from realizing their potential. Along with changing the issues to keep up with the changing times, I think it's important to set a stage for what was happening in society in general. The 1960s were a tumultuous time in history. It was the Vietnam War created the peace movement, and the peace movement certainly was an all-consuming, festering problem of how do we get out of Vietnam. The draft was taking so many young men, and all they could see ahead of them was going to war, to fight a war that they didn't understand and in a country they'd never heard of. It was a period of turmoil in civil rights after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1963, and the more violent elements in that movement took over. There was rioting and cities burned because of the frustration that was felt in the civil rights movement, and that the country was not taking any steps to eliminate the discrimination against African Americans. And then along with that was the beginnings of the women's movement. The maybe because women had worked in both those, they then decided that that women too had reason to rebel, and to because many women, all they had to look forward to was submissiveness and conformity, unless life changed for them, unless they were treated equally and had equal opportunities. So going into that period of 68, 69, 71 was a very important transition time from the period in the 60s when everything was supposed to be great. Families stayed together, husbands worked, women stayed home, took care of children, to the time when everyone was out rallying, wanting to make change in society, and were not getting responses from their government to do it. The Civil Rights Voting Act of 64 and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 from Congress certainly began to make some movements. The war was still a problem, and by 71, here in Oregon, in this legislature, in this small state on the West Coast, it could be felt. It was everywhere. University of Oregon was considered, became later in the 60s, the hippie capital of the world, because it was the alternate society community. I shouldn't say University of Oregon, it was Lane County, that many young people were looking for. They wanted some other kind of life, not the kind of life that they had known, that saw that their mother and father had. And that manifested itself, I think, in the state legislature, because by 71, all I had known when I was in the House of lobbyists were business lobby and labor lobby and some professional lobbyists, some doctors association, lawyers association, whatever. By 71, we had many groups organizing to send lobbyists to the legislature, citizens groups, Thousand Friends of Oregon, Oregon Environmental Council, Transportation Committee, Sensible Transportation Options for People, I think it was called, STOP. We had legal aid representatives here, representing poor people, people on welfare. And I remember a lobbyist stopping me once in the hallway and bemoaning the fact, an old-time lobbyist, bemoaning the fact that they couldn't get to see the legislators they wanted to see anymore because of all these other people who were here taking time in committee and also wanting to see their elected representatives. And he says, and besides that, they act like they own the place. And I just sort of wanted to say, well, probably they do own the place, just as much as these the labor lobbyists and the business lobby. Things were changing. They were changing in the world. They were changing in our country. They were changing in Oregon. They were changing here at the legislature. Along with that change, of course, was some ideas about modernizing the legislative process and hopefully getting legislators some offices and getting them some staff. And computers didn't come along for another decade, really, so that they were usable, but to average people. But the idea that there was a tremendous transition period going on just affected every aspect of life, and we felt it here in the Capitol. In 1971, we had the beginnings of land use and environmental legislation. One very important bill was the bottle bill, which started out as simply a litter control bill on the beaches, then became an energy conservation bill, then became a full-blown environmental bill, for all reasons, all the past reasons that had been given for having it. And I was instrumental in saving that bottle bill in my committee from the throes of the expert lobbyists who came to Salem, so-called expert lobbyists from back east, to tell us how ignorant we were in Oregon about we'd even consider such a bill, and that we didn't realize what economic impact it was going to have on the whole country and all sorts of dire consequences should we pass the bottle bill in Oregon. But the bottle bill did pass. It was in my committee. I had 3 votes in that committee out of 5 all along, and they stuck with me through the entire time that we had the bill in our committee, and we barely got it out and got it passed before the end of the 1971 session. That story, too, is in the memoir that I've written about my years in politics and law in Oregon. I think with all of those young people, and they were primarily young people, college-educated, young people who had worked in the McCarthy campaign, who in '68, who had worked, Gene McCarthy campaign, who had worked in the George McGovern campaign in '72, had worked certainly in the Robert Kennedy campaign in '68. I had observed the Democratic Party disaster in Chicago in 1968, and I was there, witness as a delegate. Certainly saw all of the violence that took place in the streets between the Chicago police and the National Guard and the young people who went there on the Vietnam issue and simply wanted to get into the platform a statement on withdrawing from Vietnam. Many of those young people were here lobbying in 71, and then some of them ran to be candidates, put up to be in the legislature in 73, and many of them made it. So in 1973, we had a legislature that and we had a Democratic Party controlled both the Senate and the House. The old coalition we thought was dead in 71, but was not. And in 73, Jason Bowe became president of the Senate, and we had a true working Democratic majority, and we had a true working Democratic majority in the House. So a lot of legislation was passed, many of it dealing with women's issues. One was the Equal Rights Amendment that had been sent out by Congress for ratification by the states. And Oregon, we women got together to form a women's caucus at Norma Paulus' suggestion that we do that. Early on, ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, and then took up various legislation to put the principle of the Equal Rights Amendment into the Oregon statutes. After the Equal Rights Amendment was passed in the 1973 session, we women who were working in the caucus, and I do want to say that it was Republicans and Democrats together. We were a very unique group. Never been enough women in the legislature, and there were 11 of us that session who just decided that we had to form a really tight coalition in order to accomplish everything that we felt had to be done. So let me just read from my memoir about the kinds of issues that we had to work on. It may be hard to imagine today that women couldn't keep their birth names when they got married, couldn't get credit in their own names, couldn't stay at a motel alone, couldn't eat at certain restaurants at lunchtime, couldn't get insurance unless they had a husband, couldn't be admitted to trade schools. It was shocking how fast the bills piled up. It was too big a task for one session, but we were determined to make a good start. Top priority, our Women's Caucus decided, were the bills that would affect the largest number of women. Those were the proposals prohibiting discrimination in public accommodation, allowing a woman to choose whether to keep her name upon marriage or to return to a former name if divorcing, and prohibiting discrimination in educational institutions and in insurance matters. We did tackle those problems. There were dozens and dozens of bills put in the legislature on all of those issues, and many, many more. Many of them did pass in that session, but ones that didn't, we had another session, 75, and continued on, and ultimately realized enough of the issues were there that it made a difference, certainly for women in Oregon. And other states were doing the same thing. It was happening in Congress. So that period of time in 73 and on was very important in the women's movement. And fortunately, we had strong national groups and state groups that were here to lobby, to give us assistance, to talk with legislators, and the coalition that was built in Oregon was absolutely essential to getting those bills passed. 1973 had been such a good session for me, and that when campaign season began to be discussed and the new governor was to be elected in 1974, my name was bandied about a bit by the press on the possibility that I might run for governor. I did not first plant that idea in the press's head, but it didn't take long for me to start thinking about it. Once they raised the subject, and people began to write notes to me and talk to me personally about the possibility of me running for governor in '74. One was Lynn Bergstein, who was in my Consumer and Business Affairs Committee a lot because he was lobbying with Legal Aid Society. And Lynn just said to me, "If you decide to run, Betty, I want to work in your campaign." Well, Lynn turned out to be the manager of that campaign, chair of that campaign, manager, I guess we'd call him. He ran the show. He was very good. So I ran for governor in 1974. Bob Straub beat me by about 8,000 votes in the primary. So it was worth the effort. I felt it was a very strong campaign. Certainly recognized me as a good campaigner. Later in the year, certainly unexpected, Wayne Morse was trying to make a comeback to get his Senate seat, 1978, back from Bob Packwood, who had beaten him 6 years earlier. Wayne Morse did win the primary, and then he became ill and died during the summer. So after Wayne Morse died, then the Democratic Party had the job of electing or nominating a person to be on the ballot to fill the vacancy. And there were four of us, as I recall, 4 or 5, who were competing for that that nomination by the State Central Committee. Met in Baker, now called Baker City, Oregon, on a Sunday, and interesting how the votes were divided up according to the numbers of people that each state represented. We had 3 or 4 ballots, and each candidate, different ones of the potential nominees were eliminated, and got down to the final ballot, and Joe Smith and I were competing against each other. I guess Jason Bowe was still in the race too. So it was interesting to watch the party's responsibility in a case like this, because it happens so rarely that at least that a state party gets to go through this procedure. Anyway, ultimately, I came out with the highest number of votes and was took that position then on the ballot, which meant gearing up again for a campaign. That campaign was totally different from the governor's race because it meant I had to go to Washington, D.C., had to meet with people back there, had to do my fundraising in Washington, D.C. primarily, had to meet with the Senate Campaign Committee, with the National Democratic Party. Issues were different, totally different. I was given a book by the Senate Campaign Committee that was kind of a summary of all the issues that they expected to be discussed in the campaigns that season, so at least I had something to bone up with. But it still was very challenging. Bob Packwood I knew in the legislature when I was in the House. He was an excellent campaigner. I knew him to be an excellent campaigner, and I knew it would be a tough race. Well, as it turned out, Packwood beat me by about 5%, so that was another defeat that year. But, amazingly, I didn't see those campaigns really as defeats, in the sense that I had my heart so set on either campaign that it was not a traumatic event for me to lose a race where I felt I had done well, had done a good campaign. It was unusual to have a woman in either race, and that whatever had happened had certainly promoted in the minds of the voters that women could be credible candidates. And so I think that those two campaigns, while risky and while I didn't win them, gave me a good name familiarity in the state of Oregon, and certainly, and I was recognized for that as being a good campaigner. I have thought once in a while if I'd stayed in partisan politics, what might have happened later on. I went to the court in 1977 after this 1977 session. There were 4 judges to be elected, or to be appointed first by the governor, and then stand for election the following year as a result of legislation that we had passed in the 1977 session. And I had been instrumental in that, and all the time that we were hearing those bills, one was to add 4 judges to the Court of Appeals, and the other one was to fund those judges, and that one was in my Ways and Means Committee. So the first one, I was vice chair of the Judiciary Committee in 1977, and that bill came through that committee, and then we had the funding bill in Ways and Means. And I was debating all during 1977 session if that would be my last, because Keith had not been in the last 2 sessions. He had decided that he needed to really spend more time practicing law, that he had given his many years to the Oregon legislature, beginning way back in the late 1950s. And so I decided that I wanted to, was thinking seriously, that I wanted to give up my partisan political position in the legislature and simply just be a darn good lawyer, just go back and practice law with Keith, and that would be our mutual interest. But then along the way, I learned that Governor Straub had promised the Women's Political Caucus that he would name one of the 4 positions to the Court of Appeals would be a woman. And his first choice, Helen Fry, who was on the circuit bench in Lane County, turned him down, which I suspect the governor was quite surprised. Not many people turned down the governor's request to do something like that. But Helen, and I verified this story with Helen. Helen said yes, he did ask her if she was interested. She told him no, that she didn't want to run a statewide campaign because she would have to give up her position as circuit court judge, and then she would, if she didn't win, she would not be a judge at all. I didn't have that problem after those 2 good campaigns, because I was willing to take that risk. I could go on the court, and I could then run an election, and if somebody filed against me, I felt certain that I would win. And if I didn't, I was thinking of leaving the legislature anyway, so to practice law. So it was not a risk-taking decision for me. In fact, I thought, what better way to practice law than to be a judge, if that was my inclination to do that next. When I went on the Court of Appeals, of course, the 3 others who were new, along with me, I think were a little bit concerned about what we found at the Court of Appeals. A lot of personal animosities between the judges, a lot of almost fear on the part of some of the staff who worked there. Certainly not an easy place to work in terms of the personnel and the attitudes. And I discovered that there were reasons for that. One was that the Chief Judge, Herb Schwab, was picked to be the Chief Judge when the court was created by the 1969 legislature because he did have a tough administrative style about him. And he would organize that new court and make it efficient and do its job as a new intermediate court between the trial court and the Supreme Court. But Herb Schwab really didn't want a woman on his court. So I encountered, I think, certainly unexpectedly, a great deal of what I considered overt discrimination in assignment of cases, in treatment of just on a personal level between Herb and myself, and that sort of carried over to the other judges a bit. But as I say this, I think about what is written in my memoir, and would prefer, I think, that analysis that's done there about what the personnel was like and what the judges were like and their background and relationship to each other is very important. What I learned from all of that sort of ordeal for about the first 2 years, while I still was learning the ropes but doing my work and getting better at it as every day and month went by, I think that I learned a lot about how a collegial court should operate, and certainly a court where everyone should be heard and all of their views taken into consideration in deciding cases, that there has to be a lot of respect, both for the intelligence of the individuals and certainly for their ability to do the work. And that attitude came around at the Court of Appeals later. And I did experience it the last 2 years I was there, after some of the other judges had retired and and new judges had come on. Sort of a different attitude with different group, different chief judge was after Herb Schwab resigned. Then we had a new chief judge, and George Joseph, whom I had known for many, many years, both in Democratic politics and as a lawyer. Things changed, and I think it was a good lesson for all of us that in a working environment, and particularly in a court system, where we're making decisions about other people's lives and their legal problems, that we have to work together on the court. When I went to the Supreme Court in 1982 and was appointed by Governor Atiyeh, and that was an interesting process in itself, because I had served with Governor Atiyeh in the state Senate, and we got along fine. He was a Republican, conservative Republican too, in my opinion. But we nevertheless had a good friendship, and I had filed for election for a position that I knew was going to be open in the near future, and Justice Tung had announced that he would be resigning. An appointment would be made, and someone would be appointed, and then that person would have to stand for election. And I simply filed for that election position. And when I then asked the governor for an appointment to talk with him about who he was considering naming to the Supreme Court, he told me that he didn't like the fact that I had filed against whoever he may appoint. And I said, well, there's a reason for that, and that's because I think it's time we have a woman on the Oregon Supreme Court. I've served well on the Court of Appeals, no doubt about it. My opinions were recognized in the press, and certainly by lawyers. I had my workload was as great as any other judge there, and Governor Tia recognized all that. And I said, but I really feel that I want you to consider me for the appointment. And he said, well, I'd like to have a woman on the court, but he said, and you've indicated your interest, and we'll give it some thought. So he did end up appointing me to the court. It's interesting that I think some of his Republican friends, Norma Paulus particularly, and others, lawyers who I had worked with and knew through the Bar Association, also supported my nomination because they looked at the work I had done on the Court of Appeals and felt that it was certainly as well done as the other judges there, and that I could handle the work on the Supreme Court. So instead of practicing law, and as a lawyer, I practiced law as a judge on the Court of Appeals and a justice on the Supreme Court, ending and stayed only at the Supreme Court for 4 years, but then decided that I wanted to retire from the court, knowing that I would miss the work, knowing that I would miss the people there, and but also knowing that I could go back into the practice of law at any time that I wanted to, and still have the opportunity to enjoy some retirement years with my husband Keith Skelton, which we did, traveling, doing that. But I found another legal career, and that was in mediation arbitration work, which was coming on the scene at about the same time that I left the Supreme Court, brand new in terms of ways to work with cases, brand new in terms of ways of settling disputes so they don't have to go to trial, and certainly brand new in the techniques that were used to resolve these disputes. So I found that very challenging and spent a good 15 to 18 years as a mediator and arbitrator. Looking back over all of these years of being in politics and law, I have to say that I think I was given more than my share of opportunities, but I also feel that I took advantage of every opportunity that came my way, and in the long run, it paid off. Well, that's been another role that I've had since leaving the bench, and that is to continue to give advice and assistance to women who want to be in politics, and or who want to be a judge. That has been a very rewarding part of my life too. Of course, I started out even earlier, while I was still in the legislature, encouraging others to run, other women to run, and certainly on the court, encouraging women to run for judge or to seek the nomination for judge. The advice I would give is to become active, work in your community, take on responsibility, and you can only demonstrate leadership ability by assuming responsibility. So it's important that when a task is to be done, that it be done well, and that the person is recognized as the one who made it happen. So it's constant work to be seen, to volunteer, to work on campaigns, and to learn the ropes. The opportunities, of course, come only if a person is prepared, and to take advantage of those opportunities. So education is important. The younger women, I say, you have to go to college. You have to complete college, and perhaps even go further, and just keep working at being prepared for whatever it is that you want to do. I started writing the book because I wanted to write about the women's movement in Oregon and what we did in the legislature. That was my first motivation. However, as I got into writing it, and I worked on the childhood part first for a family reunion, I realized that where we all are in life depends upon where we've been. And where we've been can go back even to our childhood days. And it seemed to me that it was important for me to tell my childhood story in order to give the background on why the things that I did in my adult life were so meaningful to me. Then I began to realize that I had to put it into a setting. And the setting, of course, had to be the whole legislature, not just what women did in the legislature. So the setting had to be all of the background and the people I worked with, the other issues we were considering, what was the interactions between individuals. And so it got to be really quite a history book. And in fact, one reviewer has said that there are 3 histories written into the book. One is the personal history, of course, and the second is the women's history. But third, it's the history of that whole period, and the history of Oregon in the political sense during the 60s and 70s. Became more than I anticipated early on. The little themes that run through the book, such as taking advantage of opportunities, dealing with rejection, and loss and disappointment and all those things, so that they don't get in the way of your progress, and learning to work with other people, learning to enjoy the good times, but know that you've worked for them. The grace part, I guess, of the book is the pleasant part of life, the successes in life, the joys of life, and so I just hope that all of that is woven together some way or other in the book, so that a reader comes out feeling that not only know more about me, but they know more about themselves. And the poem is, when we walk to the edge of all the light we have and take the step into the darkness of the unknown, we must believe one of 2 things will happen. There will be something solid for us to stand on, or we will be taught how to fly. And this goes back to the grace part of the book, because I tried to define it as my Unitarian minister defines grace. And part of that definition, she said, is that we have to step out of the place that has always held us in order to know grace. And then this poem talks about stepping out of the shadows, and we'll find something solid to stand on, or we'll be taught how to fly. The 2 of them both say take steps. So we step out of what has held us, and then we find the solid ground. And that's kind of the message that may not come through. I leave the poem at the end of the book sort of dangling there for the reader to think about in terms of his or her own life, and what are the steps that person has taken, and where have they found the solid ground, or where have they even had to learn how to fly in order to get around obstacles to get around and to go on their own way, their own path, their own trailblazing, to find whatever it is that they are exploring. So it may be too subtle. I've tried to talk with Grace with different groups of people. Some are very receptive and some are not. Some will think I'm thinking religion. I quickly put that aside and just say, I mean this in a secular sense of our everyday experiences, of what we experience. And some people can call it faith, some people can call it hope, some people can call it realization of a success. It's whatever we all want it to be, but it's the good part of life that happens because we've worked very hard to to accomplish our goals. So that's why the poem is just left there to think about. And I saw her grit and grace differently than she saw it. I, as the observer, she was raised in the Southern Methodist, very conservative church, and in those days, very conservative, may still be. So she related grace in a religious way, that it was spiritual and so on. I think grace is a very, very practical, useful, everyday occurrence, and that we should adopt it as a secular term as well as a religious term. It's just something that's useful to us as we go through this journey, and I think that everyone may have a totally different take on it. It's very personal. It's a very personal concept, and is individual. Each individual has to find whatever is helpful for that person to get through this crazy life.